In court, my parents testified that I was completely unhinged and too irresponsible to manage a single dime of my inheritance. They demanded the judge hand over my bank accounts, my car, and the empty commercial lot my grandmother had left me. Their expensive lawyer smiled with extreme confidence, acting as if the verdict was already sealed. That is until the judge opened the thick federal envelope detailing the actual list of my assets. The color completely drained from the face of the judge. He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward, and shouted to stop the proceedings and call security immediately. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a family who underestimated your true worth. Growing up in our affluent neighborhood meant projecting absolute privilege to outsiders. Inside our perfectly manicured home, however, emotional coldness and harsh judgment permeated every single corner. The undeniable reality of my family dynamic was always on full display during our post-church Sunday barbecues. The smell of hickory smoke and my mother Patricia making baked macaroni and cheese hung heavy in the warm afternoon air. It was a sacred tradition for our family to gather after service. It was also the perfect stage for their favorite weekly pastime, which was putting me firmly in my place. I had just finished setting the heavy ceramic bowls on the patio table and reached for a plate of ribs to finally get something to eat. My mother stepped right in front of me and snatched the plate directly out of my own two hands. She did not even look me in the eye as she spun around and shoved the overflowing plate toward DeAndre. He was the husband of my older sister Chloe, and the undisputed golden child by marriage. My mother fawned over him, adjusting his napkin and asking if he needed more sweet tea. I simply stood there with empty hands, swallowing the familiar lump of humiliation in my throat. DeAndre sat at the head of the patio table wearing a tailored linen suit that screamed new money and desperate arrogance. He took a slow bite of the meat, wiped his mouth with exaggerated care, and then reached into his expensive leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents and dropped them right onto the center of the patio table. The heavy thud of the paper silenced the background music playing from the outdoor speakers. "I need you to sign these right now, Nia," he commanded, using a tone reserved for unruly subordinates. He tapped a manicured finger against the top page. "It is the transfer deed for that abandoned commercial lot your grandmother left you. My firm is acquiring the entire block. We are developing a massive luxury condo complex, and your pile of rubble is standing directly in the way of progress." I stared at the paperwork. My grandmother had left me that specific piece of property in her will because she knew I loved the neighborhood. It was the only thing I owned that my parents could not control. I looked from DeAndre to my father Gerald, who was manning the grill. "You need to listen to your brother-in-law, Nia," my father boomed over the sizzle of the barbecue. He pointed his metal tongs at me like a massive weapon. "You are an absolute embarrassment to this family. You are 32 years old, and you waste your time painting murals and fixing up junk buildings in the worst parts of the city. You have no real career and no husband. DeAndre is doing you a massive favor. He is willing to pay you $50,000 for that useless dirt. That is more than enough for you to live on while you figure out how to stop being such a massive disappointment." My older sister Chloe chimed in right on cue. She leaned back in her custom designer patio chair, swirling a mimosa. She looked me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "Look at you, Nia. You showed up to a Sunday family dinner wearing paint-splattered jeans and a cheap shirt. You look like you just crawled out of a dumpster. You clearly have no idea how to manage money or property. Just sign the paper so DeAndre can build something that actually brings value to the community. You should be on your knees thanking us for bailing you out of your miserable artistic phase." I took a deep breath, letting the cool air fill my aching lungs. The old Nia, the one who spent her entire life shrinking to make them comfortable, would have cried. She would have signed the paper just to stop the yelling. But the woman standing on that patio was entirely different. I calmly reached out and pushed the stack of legal documents right back across the table toward DeAndre. I am not signing anything, I said, my voice dangerously steady. That land belongs to me. Grandma left it to me for a reason, and it is absolutely not for sale. The silence that followed was completely deafening. My mother dropped her serving spoon. My father turned away from the grill, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. DeAndre let out a harsh, mocking laugh. You are not in a position to negotiate. Nia, DeAndre sneered. You are practically broke. You drive a 10-year-old car and live in a tiny studio apartment. I am offering you a lifeline. Do not be stupid. I leaned forward, resting my hands on the table and locked eyes with my mother. Broke, I repeated softly. Is that the narrative we are going with today? Because last time I checked, I had a fully funded college savings account until someone drained it. I shifted my gaze to Chloe, who suddenly looked very uncomfortable. Do you want to remind everyone how you paid for your lavish destination wedding in Santorini, Chloe? Because I distinctly remember my tuition money disappearing right around the time you were booking first-class tickets and buying a custom wedding gown. Chloe slammed her mimosa glass down on the glass table. That is completely different, and you know it, she shouted. I was marrying an executive. I needed a wedding that reflected our social standing. You were just taking useless art classes. Dad made a financial decision for the good of the family image. Stealing your youngest daughter and her future to pay for a party is not a financial decision, I fired back. It is theft. And just like you stole my education, you are not going to steal the only thing Grandma left me. You can build your luxury condos somewhere else, DeAndre. My property stays exactly as it is. My father threw his tongs onto the ground with a loud metallic crash. He stormed over to me, his chest heaving with rage. Do not you dare speak to your sister and your brother-in-law with that kind of disrespect, he roared. We gave you everything. We put a roof over your head and fed you, and this is how you repay us. By humiliating us and ruining a multi-million-dollar deal for DeAndre. You are a selfish, ungrateful child. I am not a child, Dad, I said, refusing to back down. I am a grown woman, and I am saying no. Then get out of my yard, my father screamed, pointing toward the street. Get off my property right now. You are not welcome at this table, and you are not welcome in this family until you learn your place. You are going to severely regret this disobedience, Nia. I promise you that. We will see to it that you learn a very hard lesson. I did not wait for another invitation to leave. I turned my back on all of them and walked out of the yard without looking back. My heart was pounding against my ribs, but I felt a strange sense of liberation. I drove back to my small studio apartment feeling lighter than I had in years. I assumed they would just give me the silent treatment for a few months. I had no idea how far they were willing to go. The next morning, I walked to a cafe to grab a coffee. The total was $5. I swiped my debit card. It beeped red, declined. The barista looked at me with pity. I am sorry, Nia, but your accounts are frozen. I stepped outside and called my bank. The representative spoke with awkward sympathy. Madam, your accounts have been frozen pursuant to a court order. Your parents filed for an emergency conservatorship claiming you are mentally incompetent. They just stole my entire life. I did not go back to my apartment. I threw my car into drive and sped straight toward Mount Zion Baptist Church. My mother was the head of the Women's Auxiliary Board, and every Monday morning they held their weekly planning committee in the fellowship hall. I knew exactly where to find her. The tires of my sedan screeched against the pavement as I pulled into the church parking lot, parking haphazardly across two spaces. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely pull the keys from the ignition. I marched up the concrete steps and pushed open the heavy double doors of the fellowship hall. The smell of stale coffee and lemon pound cake hit me instantly. The room was set up with circular tables draped in white linens. At the very center of the room sat my mother. Patricia was surrounded by a tight circle of the most influential church ladies, including the wife of Pastor Williams. My mother was clutching a delicate lace handkerchief, pressing it to the corners of her eyes. I could see her shoulders trembling. She was putting on a masterclass in performative grief. The older women were leaning in, cooing softly and rubbing her back. The hushed, judgmental whispers of the congregation filled the room like a swarm of locusts. I could hear fragments of their gossip. They were saying it was such a tragedy and praising my parents for bearing such a heavy cross. I did not hesitate. I walked straight down the center aisle, my footsteps echoing off the high vaulted ceilings. The polite chatter died instantly. Every head turned in my direction. The church ladies gasped, clutching their pearls and Bibles, as I stopped directly in front of my mother's table. "You froze my bank accounts," I said. My voice was loud enough to carry to the back of the hall, but completely steady. "You went to a judge and filed a fraudulent court order behind my back." My mother gasped, dropping her lace handkerchief onto the table. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, playing the role of the frightened victim flawlessly. She immediately shrank back into her chair, seeking the protection of the women around her. Pastor Williams stepped out from his office nearby, drawn by the commotion. "Oh, Nia," my mother wailed, her voice cracking with manufactured agony. She looked up at the pastor. "Please, Pastor Williams, you have to understand. She is not well. We are just trying to get her the medical help she so desperately needs right now." I stared at her in absolute disbelief. "Medical help," I repeated. "I am perfectly fine. You are trying to steal my property. You stole my money so I cannot even buy a cup of coffee." Patricia shook her head vigorously, burying her face in her hands. "She is suffering from severe paranoid delusions," my mother cried out, ensuring her voice echoed for the entire hall to hear. "She thinks her own family is conspiring against her. We had to step in. We are just trying to protect her from herself before she does something dangerous. The doctors warned us she would lash out like this." "What doctors?" I demanded, stepping closer. "I have not seen a doctor. You are lying to everyone in this room." Suddenly, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder with bruising force. I spun around to find my father Gerald looming over me. He was wearing his tailored deacon suit, his face a mask of righteous indignation. He used his physical size to block me from getting any closer to the table. He turned to the two burly men standing by the doors who served as church ushers. "Brothers," Gerald barked, using his unquestioned status as a senior deacon. "Please escort my daughter out of the sanctuary. She is having a severe mental episode and disrupting the sanctity of this church." The two ushers hurried over and grabbed my arms. I tried to pull away, but their grips were like iron visages. "Let go of me," I commanded, fighting against their hold. "I am not crazy. They are stealing my assets." My sister Chloe stepped out from the shadows near the kitchen. She had clearly been waiting for this exact moment. She walked up to me wearing a smug, victorious smile that made my blood boil. As the ushers began to drag me backward toward the exit, Chloe leaned in close, her face mere inches from mine. "You should have just signed the paper yesterday," Chloe whispered maliciously right into my ear. Her breath smelled like expensive peppermint mints. "Now we are taking everything. We are going to pack up your pathetic little apartment this weekend. We already have a buyer lined up for your car. Dad says it will be just enough to pay for your mandatory psychiatric care at the facility he chose. Enjoy your padded room, Nia." I struggled against the ushers, but it was entirely useless. They hauled me backward through the fellowship hall, pushing through the heavy double doors and dragging me out into the bright morning sunlight. They released me at the bottom of the concrete steps, warning me not to come back inside and disturb the congregation again. I stumbled forward, catching my balance on the hood of a nearby car. My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. My own family had just orchestrated a complete character assassination in front of the entire community. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. "Well, well, well, look at the independent artist now." The slick, arrogant voice came from directly behind me. I turned around. DeAndre was leaning casually against the driver's side door of his jet-black Mercedes-Benz. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy suit, twirling his car keys around his index finger. The charming, respectful son-in-law persona he wore inside the church was completely gone. His face was twisted into a hard, sneering expression. "What did you do, DeAndre?" I demanded, marching toward him. "How did you get a judge to sign a conservatorship in less than 24 hours? DeAndre laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed across the empty section of the parking lot. He pushed himself off the car and walked slowly toward me, dropping the charade entirely. "You really think you are smarter than me, Nia?" he taunted, stopping just 2 feet away. "You think you can embarrass me in front of my wife and my in-laws and just walk away? I am a highly connected real estate developer. I do not take no for an answer, especially from a nobody like you." He leaned in close, his dark eyes flashing with pure malice. "You want to know how I did it? It is simple. I paid off a corrupt psychiatrist who owes me a massive favor. He gladly forged a comprehensive medical evaluation, declaring you legally incompetent and a danger to yourself. He documented a history of severe manic episodes and financial instability. A judge took one look at your bank accounts, your lifestyle choices, and the sworn testimony of your loving parents, and signed the emergency order without a second thought. You forged medical documents," I stated, my voice dropping low. "That is a federal crime, DeAndre. You are going to go to prison." He scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Who is going to report me?" "You, the mentally unstable girl who just got dragged out of a church by security. No one is going to believe a single word you say, Nia. Your parents have already convinced everyone in town that you have lost your mind." He took another step forward, invading my personal space. His arrogant facade cracked for just a fraction of a second, revealing a desperate, frantic energy underneath. "I need that land, Nia," he snarled, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I am not asking you anymore. I am telling you. My real estate fund is bleeding cash. I have a massive deficit, and my investors are starting to ask very uncomfortable questions. If I do not break ground on that luxury condo project by the end of the month, my entire firm goes under. Your grandmother's prime commercial lot is the only thing that will save my portfolio." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a folded document. He shoved it roughly against my chest. "This is a power of attorney transfer," he commanded. "Sign it right now. You give me full legal control over the property, and I will tell your parents to drop the conservatorship. You can go back to painting walls and living your pathetic little life. But if you refuse, I will make sure the judge finalizes the permanent order at tomorrow's hearing. You will lose your apartment, your car, and every single right you have as an adult." DeAndre stepped back, pointing a perfectly manicured finger right at my face. "You are going to sign it, or you are going to spend the rest of your miserable life getting a weekly allowance from your mommy. The choice is yours." He turned around, got into his expensive Mercedes, and sped out of the church parking lot, leaving me standing alone on the hot asphalt. I watched the taillights of his Mercedes disappear down the street, blending into the Sunday morning traffic. The suffocating heat of the asphalt radiated through the soles of my work boots, but the trembling in my hands completely stopped. The defensive posture I had worn like a heavy cloak all my life, the hunched shoulders, the lowered gaze, the quiet submission, it all evaporated in the stifling summer air. I was done shrinking. I walked over to my 10-year-old sedan. To my family, it was the ultimate symbol of my failure. To me, it was the perfect camouflage. I unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. I did not drive toward my modest studio apartment. I turned the steering wheel and headed straight for the heart of the downtown financial district. I thought about all the years I spent carefully cultivating my persona as the struggling artist. I drove a battered car and lived in a tiny apartment specifically to avoid their relentless greed. I knew the moment my family discovered I had money, they would tear me apart trying to take it. But they were trying to tear me apart anyway, just for the illusion of absolute control. The steering wheel felt solid under my grip as I navigated the Sunday traffic. My grandmother had warned me before she died. She told me that blood does not make a family, and that predators will always hunt the quiet ones. She left me that specific lot on 4th Street because she knew I was the only one who saw its true value. The skyline shifted from residential neighborhoods to towering structures of steel and reflective glass. I pulled into the private underground parking garage of the tallest high-rise on the block. The security guard at the gate immediately straightened his posture when he saw my license plate. "Good morning, boss," he said, pressing the button to raise the heavy steel barricade. I gave him a nod and parked in my reserved spot right next to the VIP elevator. I bypassed the main lobby, entirely stepping into the private elevator car that required a secure biometric scan to operate. I pressed my thumb against the glowing blue reader, and the doors slid shut, whisking me up to the top floor. When the elevator doors glided open, I stepped onto plush charcoal carpet. The heavy glass double doors in front of me were frosted with a sleek modern logo, Vanguard Urban Holdings. I pushed them open and walked into the bustling reception area. This was not the headquarters of a struggling community artist. This was the nerve center of an $85 million anti-gentrification empire. I was the secret founder and sole chief executive officer. While my father proudly bragged about DeAndre flipping a few properties for a quick profit, I was quietly buying up entire neglected blocks in historically black neighborhoods. I was not just painting murals on old brick walls. I was transforming abandoned warehouses into state-of-the-art affordable housing technology incubators and community health centers. I walked past the reception desk where my assistant handed me a freshly brewed espresso without a word. I pushed open the solid oak door to my pristine corner office. The room boasted floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the entire city. Sitting around my custom glass conference table was my executive crisis team. Marcus, my lead corporate counsel, looked up from his laptop. Elena, my chief financial officer, sat next to him reviewing a stack of printed financial ledgers. They both stood up the moment I walked into the room. "We have a massive situation," Nia, Marcus said, his voice tight with professional urgency. "Your personal bank accounts were frozen at exactly 8 in the morning. We caught the alert through our internal security monitoring." I took a sip of the hot espresso and walked over to my desk, dropping my keys onto the polished wood. I know I said my voice perfectly calm. My parents ambushed me at the church. They filed for an emergency conservatorship. DeAndre confronted me in the parking lot and admitted he paid off a corrupt psychiatrist to forge a medical evaluation. They told a judge I am suffering from severe paranoid delusions and declared me legally incompetent. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That is completely insane. They cannot possibly get away with that. You run a massive corporate entity. We can have this thrown out of court in 10 minutes. Marcus was already typing furiously on his laptop. He looked up, his jaw set in a hard line. "Actually, Elena, it is a terrifyingly effective strategy if you do not know who Nia really is." DeAndre filed an ex parte emergency petition. That means he went to a judge secretly claiming Nia was in immediate danger and could not be notified. He found a doctor willing to diagnose her with severe schizophrenic paranoia. With a forged psychiatric evaluation and sworn affidavits from her own parents, the judge granted a temporary freeze on her personal assets to prevent her from allegedly harming herself financially. He used the legal system as a weapon to strip her of her rights before she could even defend herself. They swept your personal checking and savings, leaving exactly $412 to make it look like you were utterly destitute. "Why is he doing this?" Elena asked, looking at me. "What is the endgame here?" "He needs the commercial lot on 4th Street, I explained, walking over to the window and looking out over the city. The one my grandmother left me in her personal will. DeAndre admitted his real estate fund is bleeding cash. He is facing a massive deficit, and his investors are closing in. He wants to seize the land through the conservatorship, bulldoze the neighborhood, and build a luxury condo complex to cover up his financial crimes. He told me if I sign over a power of attorney, he will drop the entire court case." Marcus stopped typing. He stared at his laptop screen for a long moment, his eyes widening. A slow, calculating smile spread across his face. He picked up his tablet and walked over to my desk, sliding the sleek device right across the smooth surface toward me. "Boss," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a low, reverent whisper. "DeAndre just made a fatal error. He is so blinded by his own arrogance that he did not do a proper title search on that property." I looked down at the tablet. The screen displayed a complex web of financial structures and property deeds. "Your grandmother's lot is not just an empty piece of land." Marcus continued tapping the screen to highlight a specific federal document. "When you transferred the primary development rights to Vanguard Urban Holdings, you structured it as the cross-collateralized anchor asset for our entire $85 million federal grant portfolio. I looked up from the tablet, meeting his eyes. Explain exactly what that means for my brother-in-law, I said. It means, Marcus replied, his smile turning dangerous, that DeAndre just stepped on a massive federal landmine. By filing a fraudulent court order to seize that specific piece of property, he is not just attacking you personally, he is attempting to illegally seize a federally backed asset. The moment his lawyer submitted that forged conservatorship petition to the county clerk, it automatically triggered a Department of Treasury fraud alert. He just committed federal wire fraud and attempted to steal government-backed collateral. If he proceeds, he is looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Elena stood up, her eyes flashing with excitement. I will call the legal department immediately. We can file an emergency injunction to block the conservatorship before the end of the day. We can crush him right now. I stared out the window, watching the tiny cars moving through the streets below. I thought about my mother's fake tears in the church. I thought about my father having me dragged out by security. I thought about Chloe whispering those vile threats in my ear, and DeAndre sneering at me in the parking lot, demanding I beg for an allowance. I turned back to my team, my expression completely unreadable. No, I said softly. Do not block the conservatorship yet. Do not file anything. Marcus and Elena looked at me in stunned silence. But Nia, Marcus protested. If we do not block it, the judge will finalize the temporary order at tomorrow's hearing. They will technically have legal control over your personal estate. I picked up the tablet and locked the screen, sliding it back to Marcus. A cold, calculated smile touched the corners of my mouth. Let them have their temporary victory, I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. Let them walk into that courtroom tomorrow morning feeling like they have completely destroyed me. If we stop them now, they will just find another way to attack me in the shadows. I want them to put all their lies on the official public record. I want them to commit perjury under oath in front of a sitting judge. I want DeAndre to present that forged document to the court and permanently seal his own fate. Do not block the conservatorship. Let them dig their own graves. I gave Marcus and Elena a final nod before leaving the pristine corner office of Vanguard Urban Holdings. The transition from billionaire CEO back to the struggling artist required a physical and mental shift. I rode the private elevator down to the parking garage, left my tailored blazer on the passenger seat of my old sedan, and drove toward the working-class neighborhood where I maintained my official residence. The studio apartment was a masterpiece of deception. It was a cramped third-floor walk-up with peeling paint near the baseboards and a radiator that clanked loudly in the winter. I kept it specifically to maintain my low profile. It was the perfect stage for the final act of my family's delusion. I had barely unlocked the deadbolt and stepped inside when a sharp, aggressive knock rattled the flimsy wooden door. I did not even have time to look through the peephole before the handle twisted and the door pushed open. My mother Patricia and my sister Chloe barged into the tiny entryway without waiting for an invitation. The heavy scent of my mother's expensive floral perfume instantly suffocated the small space, overriding the smell of turpentine and oil paints I deliberately kept in the room. Look at this pathetic place, Chloe sneered, wrinkling her nose as she stepped onto the scuffed laminate flooring. She did not take off her designer sunglasses. She just pushed them up onto her head, using them as a headband, while she surveyed my modest living conditions with absolute disgust. I cannot believe you actually live like this, Nia. It smells like failure and cheap canvas in here. I crossed my arms, wrapping them around my torso in a carefully calculated display of defensiveness. You are trespassing, I said, keeping my voice low and intentionally shaky. You cannot just walk into my home. It is not going to be your home for much longer, Chloe replied with a malicious giggle. She walked past me, brushing her expensive leather handbag against my arm. She began pacing around the small room, touching my belongings with blatant disrespect. She picked up a jar of paintbrushes, inspected them critically, and dropped them back onto the desk with a loud clatter. She walked over to the small flat-screen television sitting on a milk crate in the corner. She tapped the plastic casing with her perfectly manicured fingernail. You know, Mom, this TV is not completely terrible, Chloe remarked casually, completely ignoring my presence. It will be perfect for the guest bedroom once we clear this place out. I call dibs on it once Nia is institutionalized. The doctors at the facility will not let her have anything with a screen anyway. It disrupts the psychiatric medication. Patricia stood near the doorway observing the exchange with cold detachment. The weeping, heartbroken mother routine she had performed so flawlessly at the church fellowship hall was entirely gone. In the privacy of my cheap apartment, she did not need the fake tears or the lace handkerchief. She was a predator assessing a trapped animal. She wore a tailored, cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than a year of rent in this building. She stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the cheap floorboards. "Enough, Chloe!" my mother snapped, though her tone held no real reprimand. "We are not here to inventory the trash. We are here on business." Patricia turned her icy gaze toward me. I forced my shoulders to slump, slightly breaking eye contact and looking down at the floor. I needed them to believe they had completely broken my spirit. "The court hearing for your permanent conservatorship is tomorrow morning," Patricia stated, her voice dripping with absolute authority. "DeAndre has already filed the necessary paperwork with the judge. Your accounts are frozen. Your assets are locked. You have absolutely no money, no legal representation, and no way out of this. You are entirely at our mercy, Nia." I let out a ragged breath, forcing my hands to tremble slightly. "Why are you doing this, Mom?" I asked, my voice cracking with manufactured despair. "Why do you hate me so much?" "I do not hate you," Patricia replied, her voice completely devoid of maternal affection. "You are simply an obstacle. You have always been an obstacle. You refuse to conform. You refuse to marry someone useful like DeAndre. You insisted on playing this ridiculous starving artist game while sitting on a piece of commercial real estate that could elevate this entire family to the next tier of society. You are selfish, Nia. We are simply correcting your selfish behavior." She took another step closer, extending her hand palm up. "I want the original deed to your grandmother's lot," she demanded. "DeAndre needs the physical document to expedite the commercial transfer tomorrow after the judge rules. He has buyers lined up, and we cannot afford any bureaucratic delays at the county clerk office. Hand it over right now, and I will make sure the judge goes easy on you regarding the facility conditions. Make this court process smoother for us, and we might allow you weekend privileges." I backed up until my shoulders hit the plaster wall. I squeezed my eyes shut, squeezing out a single, perfectly calculated tear. It rolled down my cheek, landing on my worn cotton shirt. I let out a broken sob, letting my entire body sag in absolute defeat. I played the role of the crushed, marginalized daughter flawlessly. "Fine," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I walked over to the small filing cabinet near my drafting table. My hands shook as I opened the bottom drawer. I reached past the sketchbooks and pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. Inside was a flawless, notarized copy of the deed. I had prepared it weeks ago, anticipating they would eventually make a physical play for the property. I turned around and walked slowly back to my mother. I held the envelope out, extending it with a trembling hand. Patricia snatched it from my grasp with the speed of a striking snake. She immediately opened the flap, pulling out the heavy parchment paper and inspecting the signatures. Her eyes gleamed with raw, unfiltered greed. "I have nothing left to fight you with," I whispered, wrapping my arms around myself again. "You win. I will not cause a scene in court. I will agree to the conservatorship tomorrow. Just please tell DeAndre to leave me alone." Patricia shoved the deed back into the envelope and tucked it securely under her arm. A triumphant smirk spread across her face. This was the moment she had been waiting for her entire life, the complete and utter subjugation of her defiant daughter. "This is what happens when you do not respect the family hierarchy, Nia," Patricia said, her voice echoing with smug satisfaction. "You thought you were so independent. You thought you could exist outside of my control. But blood always dictates the order of things. You are the bottom of the ladder. You will always be the bottom of the ladder. Try to remember that when you are sitting in your designated room at the clinic." She turned on her heel and marched toward the door. "Come along, Chloe," she commanded. "We have a delivery to make to DeAndre." Chloe giggled, adjusting her sunglasses. See you in court tomorrow, sis, she mocked, waving her fingers at me. Try to wear something nice before they put you in a hospital gown. The heavy wooden door slammed shut behind them, rattling the cheap frame. I stood completely still in the center of the cramped room, listening to their footsteps echo down the stairwell. I waited until I heard the heavy metal security door on the ground floor groan open and click shut. The moment the building went silent, my entire posture changed. The trembling in my hands vanished instantly. The slumped, defeated shoulders straightened. I wiped the single dried tear from my cheek with the back of my hand. The struggling, broken daughter was gone. The CEO of Vanguard Urban Holdings was back in control. I walked over to my desk and pushed aside a stack of blank canvases, revealing a sleek, high-end laptop hidden beneath them. I opened the device and typed in a complex, encrypted password. The screen flared to life. I bypassed my normal desktop interface and opened a highly secured proprietary software program built specifically by Vanguard's internal cybersecurity division. When I handed Patricia the envelope, I had not just given her a copy of the deed. Slipped imperceptibly between the layers of the heavy parchment paper was a microscopic audio and video transmitting bug. It was military-grade technology, undetectable to the naked eye, and currently broadcasting a crystal-clear encrypted signal directly to my laptop. I clicked the application and pulled up the hidden surveillance feed. The screen displayed a high-definition view from inside the envelope, looking out through a tiny puncture hole I had deliberately made in the paper flap. The feed was dark for a few minutes as the envelope sat on the passenger seat of Patricia's car. I watched the shadows of passing streetlights wash over the camera lens. 20 minutes later, the feed shifted abruptly. The envelope was lifted into the air, and the bright fluorescent lights of a sleek, modern office flooded the screen. I saw the edge of a mahogany desk. Then DeAndre's face came into perfect focus as he pulled the deed from the envelope. He was sitting in his executive office, completely unaware that he was broadcasting directly to the person he thought he had just destroyed. He laid the document flat on his desk, his eyes scanning the signatures. A look of absolute predatory triumph washed over his face. He picked up his desk phone and punched in a sequence of numbers, holding the receiver to his ear. I turned the volume up on my laptop, listening intently. "Yeah, it is me," DeAndre said, his voice crackling clearly through my speakers. "I got the deed." The stupid girl completely folded. She handed it over without a fight and agreed to submit to the conservatorship tomorrow morning. He paused, listening to the person on the other end of the line. "I do not care about the optics," DeAndre snapped impatiently. "The judge is in my pocket and the parents are playing their part perfectly. I have the physical collateral now. Wire the $10 million from the offshore account into the primary development fund immediately. The land is mine tomorrow. I will break ground on the condos by Monday, and those federal auditors will never know the money was missing." He hung up the phone and leaned back in his chair, staring hungrily at the deed. I sat alone in my modest studio apartment, the blue light of the laptop screen illuminating my face in the dim room. A cold, ruthless smile spread across my lips. DeAndre had just confirmed his entire fraudulent scheme on tape. He had just admitted to moving offshore funds to cover up his federal grant deficit. He thought he was holding the key to his salvation. He did not realize he was holding a live grenade. He had taken the bait perfectly. The trap was set and the jaws were ready to snap shut. The blue light of the laptop screen faded into black as I closed the lid. The trap was set and the jaws were ready to snap shut. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the darkness of my studio apartment, listening to the city wake up around me. The clanking radiator and the distant wail of sirens felt different this morning. They were no longer the soundtrack of my camouflage. They were the overture to my absolute victory. When the sun finally breached the horizon, I stood up and walked to my tiny closet. It was time to put on my armor. I bypassed the paint-splattered overalls and the faded denim jeans I usually wore to family dinners. I reached to the very back of the closet and unzipped a heavy canvas garment bag. Inside hung a custom-tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford power suit. The fabric was immaculate, the cut razor-sharp. It was the suit I wore when negotiating $85 million federal grants. It was the suit of a conqueror. I slipped it on, feeling the immediate psychological shift. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and black stiletto pumps that clicked against the floorboards like the cocking of a loaded weapon. To complete the illusion, I draped a modest, slightly worn beige trench coat over my shoulders, buttoning it all the way up to my collarbone. It completely obscured the designer suit beneath. I tied my hair back into a severe practical bun. I looked exactly like the broken, destitute artist my family expected to see. The county courthouse was a sprawling monument to justice built with imposing granite pillars and wide marble steps. I arrived 30 minutes early, bypassing the heavy media presence gathering for a high-profile corruption trial in another wing. I found my assigned courtroom on the 4th floor. The hallway outside was wide and echoey, lined with polished wooden benches and flickering fluorescent lights. I took a seat on the farthest bench, crossing my ankles and resting my hands neatly in my lap. I did not pull out a phone. I did not fidget. I sat with the absolute stillness of a predator waiting in the high grass. It took 10 minutes for the circus to arrive. I heard them before I saw them. My family did not walk into the courthouse like people attending a somber legal proceeding regarding a loved one's mental health. They descended upon the 4th floor hallway, treating it like a red carpet event. Patricia led the charge. My mother was dressed for the cameras she secretly hoped would be there. She wore a somber but stunningly expensive tailored black Chanel suit. The skirt fell to the perfect conservative length, but the cut screamed wealth. She had accessorized with a single strand of understated pearls and a black fascinator veil that slightly obscured her eyes. She was fully prepared to play the role of the tragically heartbroken mother forced to institutionalize her beloved but deeply disturbed daughter. Her posture was a masterclass in theatrical grief, though her eyes darted around the hallway with sharp, calculating ambition. My father, Gerald, walked beside her, chest puffed out completely, ignoring the solemnity of the judicial environment. He wore a sharp navy pinstripe suit, adjusting his gold cufflinks with practiced arrogance. He looked like a man about to close a highly lucrative corporate merger, not a father about to strip his child of her civil liberties. Right behind them walked DeAndre and Chloe. DeAndre was practically glowing. His custom suit clung to his frame, and he walked with a strut that bordered on a victory dance. He checked the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist, a nervous habit betraying the massive financial leverage he was attempting to pull off today. He believed he was hours away from securing a $10 million illegal bridge loan, using my grandmother's land as collateral. He thought he had outsmarted everyone. Chloe clung to DeAndre's arm, swinging a bright red Birkin bag that cost more than my fake studio apartment's yearly rent. She was giggling at something DeAndre whispered, looking around the dreary courthouse hallway as if she were touring a new luxury shopping mall. They spotted me sitting on the wooden bench. The entire group halted, their polite murmurs dying instantly. Patricia's face hardened, dropping the grieving mother act the second she realized we were alone in the corridor. They moved toward me as a unified front, an impenetrable wall of familial toxicity. They surrounded the bench, looming over me to establish physical dominance. I did not shrink back. I did not look away. I remained completely silent, my posture unnervingly straight, under the oversized beige trench coat. Gerald stepped forward, planting his expensive leather shoes directly in front of me. He looked down, his face twisted into a mask of authoritative condescension. "Listen to me very carefully," Nia Gerald commanded, his voice echoing sharply against the marble walls. "You are going to walk into that courtroom, and you are going to keep your mouth completely shut. You will not speak unless the judge explicitly asks you a direct question. And when she does, you will simply agree that you are overwhelmed and need our guidance." I stared at the knot of his silk tie, offering absolutely no response. The silence unnerved him slightly, but his arrogance quickly pushed the hesitation away. "If you behave yourself today," Gerald continued, adopting a tone of benevolent mercy, "we have decided to be generous. Once the conservatorship is finalized and we take control of your assets, I will personally authorize a $500 monthly allowance for your personal expenses. It is more than enough for someone in your condition to live on while you receive the psychiatric care you desperately need." Do not make a scene, and we will make sure you are taken care of. $500. A monthly allowance from a man who was helping my brother-in-law steal a multi-million-dollar federal asset. The sheer audacity of the offer was almost poetic. I blinked slowly, keeping my facial muscles completely relaxed. I did not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Chloe stepped forward, pushing past our father. She leaned over, placing her manicured hands on her knees to look me directly in the eyes. Her breath smelled of expensive vanilla lattes and sheer malice. "You do not even have to worry about your parking spot anymore, sis," Chloe joked, a high-pitched, malicious giggle escaping her throat. "I actually already picked out a buyer for that pathetic little clunker you drive. One of DeAndre's junior contractors needs a beater car for his teenage son. We are letting it go for $1,000. DeAndre says it will perfectly cover your first week of meals at the inpatient facility. You should really be thanking us." I shifted my gaze from Gerald to Chloe. My eyes were completely void of fear. I did not look like a victim. I did not look like a broken daughter facing institutionalization. My unwavering stare lacked the frantic panic they expected. I let them hurl their insults. I let them outline their grand plans to strip my life down to the studs. I absorbed every single cruel word, storing it away in a mental vault. Every insult was another nail in their respective coffins. DeAndre stood at the back of the group, watching me closely. He did not speak, but his smug satisfaction radiated from his pores. He tapped his Rolex again, offering me a slow, victorious wink. He was absolutely convinced he was the smartest person in the building. He was convinced my silence was the ultimate proof of my total submission. He had no idea my cybersecurity team had already intercepted his digital lien filing late last night. He had no idea he had legally crossed the point of no return by forging my signature on a federally backed asset agreement. The heavy wooden doors of the courtroom suddenly swung open, interrupting their toxic gloating. A uniformed bailiff stepped out into the hallway holding a clipboard. "Docket number 409, the bailiff announced, his voice booming with official authority. "In the matter of the conservatorship of Nia Wilson, all parties please enter the courtroom." The energy in the hallway shifted instantly. The malicious smirks vanished from my family's faces, replaced immediately by masks of somber civic duty. Patricia hurriedly adjusted her black fascinator veil, forcing her eyes to water on command. Gerald straightened his suit jacket, adopting the grave expression of a burdened patriarch. As they began to move toward the heavy oak doors, DeAndre's high-priced defense attorney stepped out from the shadows near the water fountain. He grabbed DeAndre by the elbow, pulling him slightly away from the rest of the family. I remained seated, tracking their movement out of the corner of my eye. My hearing was sharp, and the echoing acoustics of the marble hallway carried their hushed whispers directly to my ears. "Listen to me very closely, DeAndre." The lawyer whispered, his face pale and serious. "You need to dial back the confidence. This particular judge is notoriously strict on asset disclosure and financial transparency. She does not play games with emergency conservatorships. Just stick exactly to the script we practiced. Nia is broke, she is crazy, and she desperately needs your protection. Do not deviate from the plan. Do not mention the commercial lot unless directly questioned." DeAndre scoffed, brushing the lawyer's hand off his expensive suit sleeve. "Relax, Counselor," DeAndre muttered, adjusting his lapels. "I have it completely under control. She is a mute artist with zero assets. This is a slam dunk." I stood up from the wooden bench. I smoothed down the front of my unassuming trench coat, ensuring my designer suit remained completely hidden. I walked past my parents, my sister, and my arrogant brother-in-law without a single glance in their direction. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the grand courtroom. The room was a cavernous space of dark mahogany and rich green leather. The air felt cold and sterile, smelling of old paper and lemon polish. I walked straight down the center aisle, passing the empty gallery benches. I approached the defendant's table on the right side of the room, taking my seat in the heavy wooden chair. I folded my hands neatly on the polished tabletop. The bailiff called the room to order, and everyone rose as the judge entered from her private chambers. Judge Eleanor Vance was a legendary figure in the county court system. She possessed a reputation for absolute ruthlessness against financial predators and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. She took her seat behind the elevated bench, arranging her robes and opening the thick manila file containing DeAndre's forged documents. My family filed into the room, taking their places at the petitioner's table directly across the aisle. Patricia was already dabbing her eyes with her lace handkerchief. Gerald stood tall and somber. DeAndre sat next to his lawyer, looking the picture of respectful concern. Judge Vance looked up from the file. Her sharp, piercing gaze swept across my family, assessing their performance with clinical detachment. Then her eyes moved across the aisle and locked directly onto mine. I did not look away. I held her gaze with absolute, unwavering authority. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Vance gave me a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. The trap was closed. The execution was about to begin. The gavel cracked against the wooden block with a sharp, echoing snap. Judge Eleanor Vance adjusted her glasses, her piercing eyes scanning the room before settling on DeAndre's attorney. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, her voice crisp and commanding, "you filed an emergency ex parte petition to strip Ms. Wilson of her civil and financial rights. The burden of proof rests entirely on your shoulders. Proceed." Sterling, a man whose slicked-back hair and overly white teeth practically radiated corporate sleaze, stood up and buttoned his suit jacket. He walked toward the center of the room, adopting a tone of faux sympathetic concern. "Your Honor, we are here today out of tragic necessity." Sterling began gesturing broadly toward my side of the room. My clients, Gerald and Patricia Wilson, along with their son-in-law, DeAndre Hayes, are stepping forward to save a young woman from herself. Naya Wilson is a failed artist living in squalor. Her living conditions are unsafe. Her mental state is rapidly deteriorating. She is entirely incapable of managing her own daily needs, let alone any financial assets. She represents an immediate danger to her own well-being. Judge Vance did not flinch. "Call your first witness," she instructed. Sterling called Dr. Arthur Penhaligon to the stand. The psychiatrist walked up to the witness box, wearing a rumpled tweed jacket and an arrogant expression. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the whole truth, sealing his own criminal fate before he even sat down. Dr. Penhaligon Sterling prompted pacing in front of the stand. "Please tell the court about your evaluation of the defendant." Penhaligon adjusted his tie, clearing his throat. "I conducted a comprehensive psychological assessment of Miss Wilson," he lied smoothly, his voice dripping with clinical authority. "I found severe indicators of acute schizophrenic paranoia coupled with manic delusions of grandeur. She exhibited disorganized thinking and a complete detachment from reality. She suffers from auditory hallucinations and severe financial dysmorphia. It is my professional medical opinion that she requires immediate long-term institutionalization in a secure psychiatric facility and a permanent financial conservatorship." "Did you physically examine her?" Sterling asked, guiding the perjury. "Yes," Penhaligon answered without hesitation. His eyes briefly flicked toward DeAndre, who gave a subtle nod of approval. The corruption was palpable. They were so confident in their shadow deals that they thought they could lie in open federal court without consequence. Next, Patricia was called. My mother approached the stand, pulling a fresh lace handkerchief from her Chanel suit pocket. Before she even sat down, her eyes welled up with perfectly manufactured tears. It was a terrifyingly impressive performance. Mrs. Wilson Sterling asked, his voice dropping an octave to convey deep sympathy. "How has your daughter's behavior changed over the past few months?" Patricia let out a ragged sob, pressing the handkerchief to her mouth. "It breaks my heart to say this," she wailed, her voice trembling with fake devastation. "But my little girl is gone. She talks to the walls, Your Honor. I visit her apartment and find her having full conversations with people who are not there. She has lost her grip on reality entirely. She refuses to eat. She refuses to bathe. She wears the same filthy clothes for weeks. We have tried everything to help her, but she just screams at us and accuses us of trying to steal from her. It is classic paranoia." She wiped a tear from her cheek, looking directly at the judge. "We just want to protect her. She is going to end up on the streets if we do not step in. We love her so much." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap beneath my beige trench coat. I did not glare, I did not interrupt. I let her commit perjury on the official court record. Every fabricated tear, every forged signature, every manufactured medical diagnosis was another federal charge being stacked against them. They were building their own prison cell right in front of me, and they were too arrogant to realize it. Gerald was called next. He marched up to the witness box, projecting the image of a strong, burdened patriarch, taking on the heavy mantle of responsibility. Mr. Wilson Sterling said, holding up a stack of bank statements. "We subpoenaed your daughter's financial records. Can you confirm the balance of her primary accounts as of yesterday morning?" Gerald leaned into the microphone, his face a mask of solemn duty. "Exactly $412, Your Honor." He shook his head, adopting a look of profound disappointment. "She has absolutely no income. She has no savings. She lives in a hovel. She drives a vehicle that is barely roadworthy. She has squandered every opportunity we ever gave her. She cannot survive on her own. As her father, it is my duty to step in when she has proven herself entirely incapable of functioning as an adult." "And what is the family's plan to provide for her care?" Sterling asked, playing his part perfectly. Gerald straightened his shoulders, puffing out his chest. "DeAndre has generously agreed to manage the empty commercial lot her grandmother foolishly left her. It is an overgrown hazard right now, but DeAndre has the capital to develop it. He will use the proceeds from that development to provide for her. He will fund a lifetime trust for Nia's medical care. We are essentially saving her life by taking that burden off her shoulders." DeAndre nodded from the petitioner's table, looking like a modern-day saint sacrificing his time for his disturbed sister-in-law. The sheer volume of lies was staggering. They had built an entire alternative universe and presented it under oath. Patricia claiming I talked to walls. Penhaligon fabricating a medical diagnosis. Gerald testifying to my utter destitution simply because my CFO, Elena, had purposefully moved all my personal capital out of those specific decoy accounts hours before the bank froze them. DeAndre framing his illegal federal land grab as a charitable family trust. Sterling turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, the evidence is overwhelming, and the testimony is uncontradicted. Ms. Wilson is destitute, unstable, and desperately in need of intervention. We respectfully request you grant full permanent conservatorship to Mr. Hayes immediately so he can begin securing the assets necessary for her long-term psychiatric care." Sterling sat down, adjusting his cuffs. DeAndre leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his legs and resting his ankle on his knee. He shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom mixed with victory. He thought it was over. He thought the gavel was about to drop on my freedom forever. He thought he was walking out of this room with the key to his $10 million offshore bailout. Chloe, who was sitting in the front row of the gallery, actually pulled out a compact mirror and began touching up her lip gloss, completely bored now that the destruction of my life was seemingly concluded. The silence in the courtroom stretched heavy and suffocating. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the steno machine, waiting for the final ruling. Judge Vance slowly closed the manila folder on her desk. She steepled her fingers, resting her chin on her hands. Her gaze swept over the petitioner's table, taking in the smug satisfaction radiating from my family. Then she turned her attention to me, sitting completely alone at the defendant's table. "Ms. Wilson." Judge Vance said, her voice cutting through the thick silence like a scalpel. "You have sat quietly through some very serious allegations. You have no legal counsel present on record. You are facing the complete loss of your autonomy, your assets, and your freedom to make basic life choices." The judge leaned forward slightly. "The petitioners have presented sworn affidavits and medical testimony suggesting you are entirely incapable of functioning in society. Before I rule on this petition, I must ask, do you have any defense to offer against these claims?" DeAndre let out a quiet, scoffing laugh under his breath. Gerald shook his head in mock pity. Patricia dabbed her dry eyes one last time. They expected me to break. They expected me to cry, scream, or launch into a frantic, unhinged rant that would perfectly validate every single lie they had just told. They were practically vibrating with anticipation, waiting for my inevitable meltdown. I took a slow, deep breath. The musty smell of the courtroom filled my lungs. I placed my hands flat on the polished wooden table and pushed myself up. I stood tall, my posture unnervingly straight. I did not tremble. I did not waver. I reached up and unbuttoned the top button of the oversized, faded beige trench coat I had worn into the building, then the second, then the third. I shrugged the heavy fabric off my shoulders and let the coat drop to the back of the heavy wooden chair. Gasps echoed from the petitioner's table. Chloe dropped her compact mirror. It clattered loudly against the wooden floorboards. DeAndre's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. Gerald gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles turning white. Patricia's jaw went slack. The destitute, struggling artist was gone. I stood before the court in a pristine power red executive suit custom-tailored to armor my frame. The silk blouse gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights. The diamond Cartier watch on my wrist caught the glare, flashing brilliantly. I looked exactly like what I was, a ruthless, highly successful corporate executive ready to execute a hostile takeover. I looked directly into my mother's terrified eyes, then shifted my gaze to DeAndre's suddenly pale, sweating face. I turned my attention back to the bench, looking Judge Vance square in the eye. "Your Honor," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute crystal-clear authority. "I do not have a defense. I have a financial disclosure." I reached down into the sleek leather briefcase sitting at my feet. I pulled out a thick, heavy federal folder sealed with a tamper-evident red tag. I walked around the defendant's table, my stiletto heels clicking sharply against the floorboards, echoing the exact rhythm of a ticking clock. I approached the bench and handed the sealed folder directly to the stunned bailiff. The bailiff took the heavy folder from my hands as if it were a live explosive. He blinked rapidly, staring at the bright red tamper-evident seal of the United States Department of the Treasury before turning and carrying it up the wooden steps to the bench. I did not rush back to my seat. I walked with deliberate, measured steps, smoothing the tailored fabric of my red blazer. I sat down and crossed my legs, watching the absolute chaos brewing at the petitioner table. Patricia leaned over, whispering frantically to Gerald. Her hands were shaking so badly her lace handkerchief fluttered like a white flag of surrender. DeAndre grabbed his lawyer by the sleeve, pulling him close. Sterling simply swatted DeAndre away, projecting the arrogant confidence of a man who thought he had already won a rigged game. Sterling offered Judge Vance a patronizing smile, clearly expecting her to throw the document out as the manic scribblings of an unwell woman. The courtroom held its collective breath. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sharp, crisp rustling of the heavy watermarked paper as Judge Vance broke the federal seal. She opened the folder and flattened the first page against her desk. She read the first paragraph. She paused. She took off her reading glasses, pulled a microfiber cloth from her robe, and wiped the lenses meticulously. She placed the glasses back on her face and read the page a second time. All the color drained from Judge Eleanor Vance's face. The hardened, skeptical expression she normally wore dissolved into a look of profound, absolute shock. She looked up from the glowing federal watermark and stared directly at Sterling. The lawyer's confident smile remained plastered on his face, completely oblivious to the legal avalanche hanging directly over his head. Counselor Judge Vance boomed, her voice echoing off the high mahogany walls like a thunderclap. "You are petitioning this court to permanently seize the assets of a woman you claim is completely destitute." Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket with a smooth, practiced motion. "Yes, Your Honor. As Dr. Penhaligon testified, the defendant is experiencing severe financial delusions. Whatever document she just handed you is undoubtedly a product of her tragic psychosis." Judge Vance did not blink. She held up the first page of the dossier. "Are you aware, Counselor, that this document is a certified federal audit from the Department of Treasury?" Sterling froze. The smug smile finally slid off his face. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Behind him, DeAndre suddenly sat up perfectly straight, his expensive chair creaking loudly in the silent room. "I see the seal, Your Honor," Sterling stammered, recovering slightly. "But anyone can print a fake seal off the internet. My client has provided sworn testimony regarding her empty bank accounts." We have the printouts from the local branch showing a balance of exactly $412. Judge Vance picked up the second page. She ignored Sterling completely and turned her furious, piercing gaze toward my father. Mr. Wilson, you just testified under oath under penalty of perjury that your daughter has squandered every opportunity and has absolutely no assets. You claim she requires your son-in-law to manage her only property to keep her from starving on the streets. Gerald stood up, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He was not used to being questioned, especially by a woman in authority. I told the truth, Your Honor, he barked, gripping the edge of the table. Look at her. She is playing dress-up. She probably stole that suit. She drives a 10-year-old car and lives in a slum. We are trying to save her life. You are trying to steal her empire. Judge. Vance shot back, her voice vibrating with suppressed fury. She flipped to the third page of the audit. Counselor, the judge continued staring at Sterling. Are you aware that your destitute client is the sole shareholder and chief executive officer of Vanguard Urban Holdings? The name dropped like a bomb in the courtroom. Gerald stumbled backward, hitting his chair. Patricia let out a strangled, gasping sound, clutching her chest. Vanguard Urban Holdings was not a secret in this city. They were the premier development firm currently buying up the entire downtown district, the exact firm DeAndre had been desperately trying to compete with and failing miserably. That is impossible, DeAndre shouted, jumping to his feet, his voice cracking with panic. Vanguard is an $80 million corporate entity. They are backed by federal housing grants. She does not own Vanguard. She paints murals in alleys. Judge Vance slammed her gavel down so hard the wooden block splintered slightly. Sit down, Mr. Hayes, or I will have you restrained, she commanded. DeAndre collapsed into his chair, his chest heaving. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden terrifying realization. The puzzle pieces were finally snapping together in his arrogant mind. He remembered the biometric locks on the elevator. He remembered the pristine corner office. He remembered the specific lot on 4th Street and why I had never sold it. It was the anchor asset for Vanguard. He had just tried to steal a federally protected cornerstone of a massive corporate portfolio. Your Honor, Sterling said, his voice shaking violently. He wiped a thick layer of sweat from his forehead. We were unaware of any corporate holdings. If the defendant has hidden assets, we can amend the conservatorship petition to include Vanguard Urban Holdings under Mr. Hayes' control. The sheer blinding greed of the lawyer was astounding. Even when faced with a federal audit, his first instinct was to figure out how to steal the $80 million instead of the empty lot. You will amend nothing, Judge Vance said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. She picked up a separate document from the back of the folder. This is a sworn affidavit from a federal auditor at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It confirms that the 4th Street property you attempted to seize this morning via an emergency ex parte order is currently serving as cross-collateral for federal development grants. The judge looked directly at DeAndre. Mr. Hayes, you submitted a property transfer request to the county clerk at 8 o'clock this morning. You claimed you already held power of attorney over Ms. Wilson. You forged her signature on a commercial lien to secure a $10 million bridge loan from an unregistered private lender. DeAndre turned the color of wet ash. He looked desperately at Sterling, but the lawyer was already backing away from the table, physically distancing himself from his own client. I had to. DeAndre blurted out, the panic completely overriding his common sense. The offshore accounts were empty. The crypto investments tanked. I just needed the land for 30 days. Just 30 days to secure the condo funding. She was not even using the lot. It was just sitting there. She does not need the money. I am family. Gerald spun around and grabbed DeAndre by the lapels of his custom suit. You told me this was legal, Gerald roared, shaking the younger man violently. You told me you just needed her out of the way to manage the trust. You used us to cover your bad debts. Patricia shrieked, grabbing Gerald's arm to pull him off DeAndre. Chloe was hyperventilating, her hands pressed over her ears as the reality of the situation crashed down on her privileged, sheltered life. Her husband was not a real estate tycoon. He was a fraud facing decades in a federal penitentiary. Order. Judge Vance bellowed, slamming the gavel repeatedly until the physical altercation at the petitioner table ceased. Gerald released DeAndre, shoving him back into the heavy wooden chair. DeAndre buried his face in his hands, his breathing ragged and shallow. Judge Vance stood up abruptly, her black robes billowing around her. The fury radiating from the bench was absolute and terrifying. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, her voice ringing with finality, "you brought a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation into my courtroom. You suborned perjury from these parents who were all too willing to institutionalize their own daughter for a cut of the profits. You attempted to use the authority of this court to facilitate a $10 million federal wire fraud scheme." Sterling raised his hands in surrender, shaking his head frantically. "Your Honor, I was misled. My client provided me with falsified information. I withdraw the petition immediately." "It is far too late for that," Judge Vance replied. She looked down at the documents one last time, then directed her blazing gaze at my parents. "Are you aware that your destitute daughter is the sole shareholder of Vanguard Urban Holdings? Her verified liquid assets and property holdings exceed $85 million. Patricia looked at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. Her eyes were wide with a horrifying mixture of profound regret and desperate calculation. She was already trying to figure out how to play the victim, how to spin this so she could somehow get access to the $85 million. "Nia, baby," Patricia cried out, taking a step toward the center aisle. "We did not know. DeAndre lied to us. We just wanted to help you. We love you. You are my daughter." I did not blink. I did not move. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me and felt absolutely nothing. The emotional manipulation that had controlled me for 3 decades was completely powerless against the armor I now wore. "Stop immediately!" Judge Vance shouted, pointing a trembling finger at my mother. "Do not take another step toward this woman." The judge turned to the armed deputies standing by the heavy oak doors. "Call security. Lock this courtroom down. No one at that table leaves this building." The heavy brass deadbolts on the oak doors slid into place with a definitive clack. It was the sound of a vault sealing shut. The 2 armed deputies stepped in front of the exit, crossing their arms. Patricia stood frozen in the center aisle, her arms still outstretched toward me. The reality of Judge Vance's command finally pierced her theatrical grief. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the straps of her quilted Chanel purse slipped from her grip. It hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, spilling its expensive contents everywhere. Gold-plated compacts, breath mints, and platinum credit cards scattered across the polished planks. She did not even look down. She just stared at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, stripped of every manipulation she had relied on for 30 years. Gerald looked as though the floor had vanished beneath him. His jaw went completely slack, his mouth hanging open in a grotesque mask of ruined authority. The powerful, arrogant patriarch who had demanded my silence in the hallway was now rendered entirely mute. His chest caved inward, his broad shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of public exposure. He looked frantically at the judge, then at DeAndre, then finally at me. He found no mercy in my gaze. Chloe, however, could not process the silent defeat. The fragile bubble of her luxury mall reality violently popped, and she reacted with pure, unhinged denial. She leaped up from the gallery bench, her face contorted into an ugly, snarling mask. "That is a lie," Chloe screamed, her voice shattering the sterile acoustics of the courtroom. "She is a dropout. She is crazy. She lives in a disgusting little box. She paints on walls. You are making a mistake. Look at her." "Sit down, young lady, or you will be joining your husband at the defense table in handcuffs," Judge Vance roared. Chloe collapsed back onto the wooden bench, sobbing hysterically into her hands. The contrast between their chaotic meltdown and my absolute stillness was poetic. I remained seated in my red executive suit, watching them drown in the very trap they had so arrogantly set for me. From the back row of the empty gallery, a sharp, confident voice cut through the lingering echoes of Chloe's outburst. "If it pleases the court," a woman announced, stepping out from the shadows of the back benches. "Evelyn Croft." My lead corporate litigator walked down the center aisle. She wore a tailored black suit, her silver hair cut into a severe bob. She carried a sleek leather briefcase and an aura of absolute legal supremacy. Evelyn did not just practice law, she wielded it like a broadsword. She bypassed my completely paralyzed family without so much as a glance in their direction and came to stand directly beside my chair at the defendant's table. "State your name for the record, counselor," Judge Vance said, her tone shifting from fury to professional curiosity. "Evelyn Croft, Your Honor," Evelyn stated smoothly, resting her hands on the table. "I represent Ms. Nia Wilson and Vanguard Urban Holdings. I apologize for my delayed introduction, but my client and I felt it was strategically necessary to allow the petitioners to place their claims firmly on the official record before we dismantled them." Sterling DeAndre's lawyer turned a sickly shade of green. He backed away from the petitioner's table, bumping into his own chair. "Your Honor." Sterling stammered, his voice pitching upward in panic. "I had no prior knowledge of this representation. I was operating strictly on the financial disclosures provided to me by Mr. Hayes. You will have plenty of time to explain your gross negligence to the State Bar Association." "Mr. Sterling," Evelyn interrupted, her voice cold and precise. "But right now I am speaking." Judge Vance nodded approvingly. "Proceed, Ms. Croft." Evelyn opened her briefcase, pulling out a secondary stack of bound documents. "Your Honor, my client is not only fully competent, but she is currently overseeing a massive federal anti-gentrification project. The commercial lot located on 4th Street, the exact parcel of land Mr. DeAndre Hayes is attempting to seize under the guise of an emergency conservatorship, is the anchor property for this federal initiative. It is fully backed by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. My client has been quietly acquiring adjacent properties for 3 years to build affordable housing and community commercial spaces." Evelyn turned slightly, casting a withering glance at DeAndre. "Mr. Hayes is not a benevolent brother-in-law trying to fund psychiatric care. He is a failed developer drowning in bad debt. He discovered my client owned the 4th Street parcel, and realizing he could not acquire it legally, fabricated this entire medical and legal charade to steal a federally protected asset." The courtroom seemed to actively drop in temperature. DeAndre sat frozen, his eyes darting frantically toward the locked doors. He was sweating profusely, heavy drops rolling down his temples and staining the collar of his custom shirt. His breathing was loud and ragged, echoing in the silent room. To further address the claims of my client's mental instability, Evelyn continued, projecting her voice toward the witness stand. "I find it fascinating that Dr. Penhaligon diagnosed Ms. Wilson with severe paranoia and financial dysmorphia based on a physical examination he never actually conducted." Everyone turned to look at the witness box. Dr. Arthur Penhaligon was no longer sitting in the chair. The disgraced psychiatrist had quietly slipped out of the witness stand and was currently inching his way along the mahogany wood paneling, desperately trying to reach the side exit door designated for court staff. He had his tweed jacket pulled tight around his chest, sweat pouring down his face, his eyes wide with animalistic panic. "Going somewhere?" Dr. Judge Vance asked, her voice dropping into a deadly whisper. Penhaligon froze mid-step, pressing his back flat against the wall. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a speeding freight train. "I just needed to use the restroom," he squeaked, his voice cracking pitifully. "I have a medical condition." "You are going to need a medical professional if you move another inch," Judge Vance snapped. "Return to the witness box immediately. You are under subpoena and you have just committed flagrant perjury in a federal proceeding. You will remain seated until I figure out exactly which federal facility to send you to." Penhaligon scrambled back to the box, practically throwing himself into the wooden chair and burying his face in his trembling hands. The entire conspiracy was unraveling in spectacular fashion right before my eyes. The satisfying crunch of their destruction was music to my ears. Evelyn turned back to the judge. "As you can see, Your Honor, the petitioners have engaged in a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. They targeted a wealthy, independent woman assuming her quiet lifestyle equated to weakness. They assumed her silence meant she was defenseless. They were catastrophically mistaken. Judge Vance picked up her gavel, her knuckles white with tension. She looked down at the documents spread across her desk, her eyes scanning the secondary file I had handed to the bailiff. The room was so quiet, I could hear the erratic ticking of DeAndre's heavy gold Rolex. "Mr. Hayes, Judge Vance," said her voice deceptively calm. She picked up a single sheet of paper from the bottom of the federal dossier. DeAndre jerked upward his chair, scraping loudly against the floor. "Yes, Your Honor," he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "I have a secondary document here provided directly by the Treasury Department." Judge Vance continued, holding the paper up to the harsh overhead lights. "It details a specific financial transaction initiated yesterday afternoon. It appears to be a bridge loan agreement for $10 million drawn against the 4th Street property." DeAndre swayed on his feet, clutching the edge of the table to keep himself upright. His mouth opened, but he could not force any words out. The arrogant strut, the victorious winks, the condescending remarks in the hallway, they were all completely gone, erased by the blinding light of federal scrutiny. "This loan agreement," Judge Vance stated, her voice rising in volume and intensity, "bears the signature of Nia Wilson, authorizing the transfer of the 4th Street parcel as collateral to an offshore holding company." Patricia gasped, pressing her hands over her mouth. Gerald stared at DeAndre, his face contorted in absolute horror, realizing the sheer magnitude of the crime his son-in-law had dragged them all into. They had thought they were just stealing a modest lot and stripping my rights. They had no idea DeAndre had already committed massive corporate fraud. However, Judge Vance boomed, her voice echoing violently off the walls. "Are you aware, Mr. Hayes, that the Federal Bureau of Investigation has been monitoring this specific property due to its federal grant status? Are you aware that they intercepted this loan document at 6 o'clock this morning?" DeAndre let out a pathetic whimper, his legs buckling slightly. Judge Vance slammed her gavel down with the force of a thunderstrike. The crack echoed like a gunshot. "Are you aware, Mr. Hayes?" Judge Vance roared, standing up abruptly from her high-backed leather chair, "that the FBI has just flagged this signature as a complete and total forgery." DeAndre collapsed back into his chair, hyperventilating. Patricia wailed aloud, a genuine sound of sheer terror. Gerald buried his face in his hands, his legacy completely obliterated. Chloe screamed again, a high-pitched sound of pure panic as the reality of their complete destruction finally settled over her. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting calmly on the table. My red suit blazed like a beacon of absolute victory in the center of their ruined lives. The jaws of the trap had fully snapped shut, crushing them entirely. The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom suddenly burst open. The heavy brass deadbolts were disengaged from the outside with a loud metallic crash. 3 men in dark suits wearing tactical bulletproof vests, clearly marked with the bright yellow letters, FBI, stepped quickly and purposefully into the room. Their faces were grim, their postures aggressive, and their hands rested cautiously near their tactical belts. DeAndre Hayes, the lead agent, announced, his voice commanding absolute compliance as he marched straight down the center aisle. "Stay exactly where you are. Keep your hands where we can see them." The execution had commenced. DeAndre stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished mahogany floor. The confident swagger that had defined his entire existence evaporated in a single second. He looked like a cornered animal, his chest heaving, his eyes darting frantically around the locked courtroom. The 3 federal agents moved with terrifying synchronized precision, spreading out to cut off any possible avenue of escape. Wait! DeAndre stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine that echoed off the high ceilings. "There is a misunderstanding. I did not do this. It was him." He thrust a trembling finger toward his attorney. "Sterling told me how to file the paperwork. He said it was a standard family trust transfer. He is the lawyer. He advised me." Sterling did not even flinch. He took another deliberate step away from the defense table, smoothing his tie with perfectly practiced indifference. "Do not attempt to drag me into your federal crimes," Mr. Hayes Sterling said, his voice dripping with cold self-preservation. I advise this court that I was provided fraudulent documents by my client. I had absolutely no knowledge of any forged signatures or illegal bridge loans. I am fully prepared to cooperate with the federal investigation. You snake! DeAndre shrieked, lunging toward the lawyer. He never made it. The lead FBI agent closed the distance in two massive strides, grabbing DeAndre by the shoulder and spinning him around with brutal efficiency. DeAndre slammed face first into the heavy wooden petitioner table. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a harsh gasp. The agent pinned DeAndre's arms behind his back. The metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around DeAndre's wrists resonated loudly in the completely silent courtroom. It was a sharp final sound, the sound of a life ending. DeAndre Hayes, the lead agent, announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, forgery, identity theft, and violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. You have the right to remain silent. DeAndre writhed against the table, his face pressed into the polished wood, his perfectly styled hair now a tangled mess. The reality of a federal racketeering charge finally penetrated his panic-stricken brain. He twisted his head desperately, searching the gallery until his wild eyes locked onto his wife. Chloe. DeAndre yelled, his voice raw and scraping against his throat. Chloe, listen to me. Call the bank. Call them right now. Transfer the house to your name. Move the joint accounts into your personal checking. Call your father's broker and liquidate the offshore funds. Do it before they freeze everything. Do it now. Chloe scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her red Birkin bag for the second time. She fell to her knees, clawing at the spilled contents, frantically searching for her diamond-encrusted phone. I am calling them, she cried, her voice thick with panic. I am calling them, DeAndre. The lead FBI agent hauled DeAndre upright, easily overpowering the struggling man. The agent looked across the room at Chloe, his expression a mask of absolute clinical detachment. Do not bother making that call, Mrs. Hayes, the agent informed her coldly. Chloe froze her phone halfway to her ear. She looked up at the armed federal agent, her mascara-streaked face twisted in confusion. What do you mean, she demanded, her privileged arrogance attempting one last pathetic stand. Those are my accounts. This is a mistake. My husband is a legitimate developer. Your husband is a federal criminal. The agent corrected, his tone completely flat. And as of 6:30 this morning, a federal judge signed a comprehensive asset forfeiture warrant. Your primary residence has been seized. Your vehicles have been impounded. Every single personal joint and corporate bank account associated with your husband's name, your name and his shell companies has been frozen under federal racketeering laws. You currently possess exactly $0.00. The phone slipped from Chloe's trembling fingers, clattering onto the floorboards. She stared at the agent, uncomprehending. The words were too massive, too devastating for her sheltered mind to process. But we have a mortgage, she whispered, her voice hollow. We have car payments. We have country club dues. I have a shopping tab at Neiman Marcus. All of those entities will be joining the long list of federal creditors, attempting to recoup their losses from your husband's fraudulent enterprise. Evelyn Croft stated, stepping forward from my side. I highly recommend you find a good bankruptcy attorney, Mrs. Hayes, though I imagine you will have trouble paying their retainer. The sheer absolute finality of the statement struck Chloe like a physical blow. The luxury mall reality she had floated in her entire life evaporated, leaving nothing but the terrifying abyss of total destitution. She let out a guttural, agonizing wail. She fell forward onto her hands and knees, her expensive stiletto heels slipping out from under her. She wept uncontrollably, her tears pooling on the courtroom floor, her perfectly manicured nails scratching at the wood. She was instantly bankrupt, instantly disgraced, and instantly reduced to the exact pathetic state they had tried to force upon me. DeAndre watched his wife collapse, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He sagged against the grip of the federal agents, defeated, broken, and completely ruined. They marched him down the center aisle of the courtroom, dragging him past the wooden benches he had strutted past just an hour ago. Gerald and Patricia watched the entire sequence unfold in a state of catatonic horror. The grand illusion of their powerful, successful family had been violently stripped away. The golden son-in-law they had constantly compared me to was being hauled off to a federal penitentiary. The wealthy daughter they had worshipped was sobbing on the floor, completely penniless. The corrupt doctor they had hired was trembling in the corner, waiting for his own arrest. And the daughter they had abused, neglected, and attempted to institutionalize was sitting calmly at the defense table, wielding an $85 million federal hammer. The silence returning to the courtroom was deafening. The only sound was Chloe's ragged, gasping sobs echoing from the floor. Then the survival instinct of a cornered narcissist kicked in. Patricia's eyes snapped away from DeAndre's, retreating back and locked onto me. The sheer, unadulterated terror in her expression was suddenly replaced by a desperate, frantic manipulation. She realized in that exact moment that her own complicity in the fraudulent conservatorship left her completely exposed to federal conspiracy charges. She realized her husband's legacy was ash. She realized her only remaining lifeline in the entire world was the daughter she had just committed perjury to destroy. Patricia scrambled around the petitioner table, her expensive Chanel skirt catching on the chair. She rushed across the open space separating us. Ms. Croft stepped directly into her path, holding up a hand. "Step back, Mrs. Wilson," Evelyn commanded sharply. "Do not approach my client." But Patricia ignored the lawyer entirely. She lunged around Evelyn's outstretched arm and closed the final few feet between us. She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging painfully into the fine fabric of my red suit jacket. The fake, sweet, grieving mother act completely vanished. The mask shattered, leaving only the raw, selfish ambition that had dictated her entire life. "Nia, tell them it is a mistake," Patricia pleaded, shaking my arm desperately. Her eyes were wild, her breathing shallow. "Tell them DeAndre had your permission." I looked down at her hands, gripping my arm, then slowly raised my eyes to meet her panicked gaze. I remained completely silent, letting her dig her own grave. Gerald stepped up behind his wife, his face pale and sweating. "Yes, Nia," he urged, his voice cracking, losing all of its former patriarchal authority. "Tell them it was a family investment strategy. We can make this all go away. We can just withdraw the psychiatric petition and pretend none of this happened. You can drop the federal charges." I stared at the two people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. I stared at the parents who had stood in a hallway exactly 1 hour ago and gleefully offered me a $500 allowance from my own stolen money while plotting to lock me inside a mental institution. Patricia gripped my arm tighter, her nails biting into my skin. "Nia, tell them it is a mistake," she begged, her voice escalating into a frantic shriek. "Tell them DeAndre had your permission. You have $85 million. You do not need that little piece of land. Save your sister's husband." The absolute sheer audacity of the demand hung in the sterile courtroom air. They were actually asking me to commit federal perjury, to lie to the FBI, to forfeit $10 million, and a key piece of a federal housing project just to protect the man who had tried to steal my life. They were demanding my sacrifice for their comfort. It was the exact same toxic dynamic that had ruled my childhood, only now the stakes were measured in federal prison sentences and millions of dollars. I slowly, deliberately reached over and peeled Patricia's trembling fingers off my red blazer. I smoothed the fabric, pushing her hand away with finality. I stood up from the wooden chair towering over my mother. I looked at Gerald trembling behind her. I looked at Chloe sobbing on the floor. I turned my gaze to Judge Vance, who was watching the exchange with an expression of absolute disgust. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream. I spoke with the calm, cold precision of an executioner delivering the final blow. "Your Honor," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive room, "I would like to officially request that the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately look into Gerald and Patricia Wilson for their direct role in a coordinated criminal conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and elder abuse against my person." Patricia let out a horrified gasp, stumbling backward as if I had shot her. Gerald's knees finally gave out, and he collapsed heavily into the nearest wooden chair. I looked down at my mother, my expression completely devoid of mercy. I am not saving anyone, I said softly. I am just cleaning out the trash. Patricia recoiled as if I had struck her across the face with a physical whip. The word trash hung in the chilled air of the courtroom, vibrating with 32 years of suppressed truth. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound emerged. She simply stood there, her expensive pearls resting against her heaving chest, staring at the daughter she had entirely miscalculated. I did not scream. I did not raise my voice or allow a single tear to form in my eyes. I simply reached out and pulled the heavy silver microphone on the defense table closer to my face. I wanted to ensure that every single syllable I spoke was captured perfectly by the court stenographer. I wanted my voice echoing off the high mahogany walls. "Save him!" I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm, carrying the crushing weight of a lifetime of emotional abuse. I looked directly into my mother's bloodshot eyes. 10 minutes ago, you sat in that wooden witness box under oath and swore to a federal judge that I was completely insane. You testified that I was a delusional, destitute failure who needed to be stripped of all basic human rights and locked in a psychiatric ward for my own good. You did that to your own daughter so you could steal an empty dirt lot. Patricia blinked rapidly, her hands fluttering in the air. "Nia, please," she stammered, her voice trembling. "We were misled. DeAndre told us you were sick. He showed us bank statements. We were trying to protect you. We thought you were living in poverty. You thought I was vulnerable." I corrected her, my tone slicing through her pathetic excuses like a scalpel. "You thought I was weak. You stood in the hallway this morning and told me that failures do not belong in this family. You told me I was a stain on the Wilson legacy because I refused to marry a superficial fraud like the man currently in federal handcuffs. You were perfectly willing to drug me and strap me to a hospital bed just to maintain your country club lifestyle." Gerald abruptly shoved his chair back and marched toward the center aisle. He puffed out his chest, attempting to inflate himself back into the towering, intimidating patriarch who had ruled my childhood through fear and financial manipulation. His face was a mottled, angry purple, but I could see the sheer terror hiding just behind his blustering facade. "Now you listen to me, Naya," Gerald bellowed, pointing a thick, shaking finger at me. "We are blood. We are a family of faith. The Lord commands us to forgive our trespasses. We go to church every single Sunday, and we uphold traditional family values. You do not send your own flesh and blood to a federal penitentiary over a misunderstanding. You drop these absurd charges right now." I let out a short, icy laugh. It amplified through the courtroom speakers, sounding like cracking glass. "Church values, Gerald?" I asked, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the polished table. "Are those the same church values that let you steal my entire college fund when I was 18, just so you could buy Chloe her first Mercedes-Benz? Are those the same pious family values that allowed you to sit at that table 10 minutes ago and actively watch your son-in-law forge my signature to facilitate a $10 million wire fraud scheme?" Gerald flinched, dropping his hand. The mention of the stolen college fund visibly rattled him. He had spent years gaslighting me about that money, claiming it was his right, as the head of the household, to reallocate family resources as he saw fit. He had forced me to work 3 separate minimum wage jobs, to put myself through night school, while Chloe drove a luxury sedan he bought with my tuition money. "I provided for you," Gerald shouted, spit flying from his lips. "I gave you a roof over your head. I put food on your plate. You owe me respect." "You gave me a prison," I shot back, my voice dropping into a dangerous, lethal register. "And the absolute moment I built my own empire entirely outside of your toxic control, you tried to steal that too. You could not handle the fact that the daughter you deemed a failure is worth $85 million, while the golden child you worshipped married a broke criminal." Chloe let out another agonizing shriek from the gallery, burying her face in her knees. She was still sitting on the floor, surrounded by her scattered designer makeup, completely unable to cope with the sudden evaporation of her fake wealth. Patricia took another desperate step toward me, her hands clasped together as if she were praying. "Nia, please." She begged, tears streaming through her heavy foundation. "We are your parents. You have $85 million. You are set for life. You do not even need that little piece of land on 4th Street. DeAndre made a terrible mistake, but you can fix it. You have the power to stop this. Save your sister's husband. Save our family from this disgrace. The blinding sheer audacity of her demand was staggering. Even when faced with federal racketeering charges and the complete destruction of their lives, Patricia's only instinct was to demand that I sacrifice my own assets to protect her favorite child. She wanted me to lie to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, to forfeit a $10 million commercial property, and to jeopardize a federally funded housing initiative just to save a man who had forged my name. "You are not my family," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or mercy. "You are simply two people who happen to share my DNA. And as of this morning, you are co-conspirators in a massive federal racketeering enterprise. I hope you wore comfortable shoes, Patricia, because federal holding cells do not have seating." Judge Vance suddenly brought her heavy wooden gavel down with a deafening crack. "That is quite enough," Judge Vance boomed, her voice radiating absolute judicial fury. The judge stood up from her high-backed leather chair, her black robes billowing around her. She leaned over the elevated bench, fixing her blazing gaze directly on my parents. Patricia froze, her hands still clasped together in fake prayer. Gerald stumbled backward, retreating toward the petitioner table as if trying to hide behind the heavy wooden furniture. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson," Judge Vance announced, her words echoing off the high ceilings with terrifying clarity. "You seem to be operating under the severe and frankly insulting misapprehension that this federal courtroom is your personal suburban living room. You seem to believe you can simply negotiate away massive federal crimes by demanding your daughter drop the charges." Judge Vance picked up the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation from her desk and held it up. "You provided sworn testimony today in my courtroom. You placed your hands on a Bible and swore to the state that you possessed first-hand knowledge of your daughter's mental incompetence. You actively supported a fraudulent conservatorship petition designed to strip an innocent woman of her civil rights, her bodily autonomy, and her corporate assets." "We did not know," Gerald stammered, raising his hands in a weak defensive gesture. "We trusted the doctor. We trusted our son-in-law. We are victims here, Your Honor." "You are not victims, Mr. Wilson," Judge Vance roared, slamming the document down onto her desk. "You are active, willing participants in a conspiracy to commit fraud upon this court. You corroborated a fake psychiatric evaluation. You attempted to weaponize the judicial system to facilitate a $10 million theft. That is not a simple misunderstanding. That is perjury." The word dropped like a lead weight. Perjury. It was the ultimate legal hammer, and Judge Vance was swinging it directly at their heads. Evelyn Croft stood perfectly still beside me, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. She did not need to say a single word. She had laid the trap brilliantly, and my parents had walked right into the center of it, willingly locking the cage behind them. "Bailiffs," Judge Vance commanded, pointing a sharp finger at Gerald and Patricia. "Detain Mr. and Mrs. Wilson immediately." The two armed deputies who had been guarding the heavy oak doors moved with sudden, terrifying speed. They marched down the center aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. "No!" Patricia screamed, backing away and colliding with the petitioner table. "You cannot do this. We are respected members of the community. We belong to the country club. Gerald, do something." Gerald tried to shove the first deputy away, his face contorted in panic. "Get your hands off me," he bellowed. "I demand to speak to my attorney. I have rights." The deputy smoothly sidestepped Gerald's clumsy push, grabbed his wrist, and twisted his arm sharply behind his back. Gerald let out a loud, pathetic yelp of pain as he was forced to bend forward over the table. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed in the room, sounding identical to the cuffs that were currently binding DeAndre. Patricia tried to run, but the second deputy caught her by the shoulders, spinning her around. She thrashed wildly, her designer dress twisting around her legs. She looked absolutely feral, her perfectly styled hair falling into her face, her makeup smeared, her expensive jewelry clanking against the deputy's utility belt. "They are to be held in the basement holding cells for questioning regarding conspiracy to commit wire fraud and suborning perjury." Judge Vance instructed, her tone completely professional and utterly devoid of pity. The federal agents will want to speak with them as soon as they finish processing Mr. Hayes. The deputies began to drag my parents toward the side door of the courtroom, the door reserved for criminals being taken down to the holding pens. Gerald stumbled, his head bowed, his massive ego entirely shattered. He did not look at me. He did not look at Chloe. He just stared at his expensive shoes as he was marched toward the exit, a thoroughly broken man. But Patricia fought until the very last second. As the deputy pulled her toward the heavy steel door, she dug her heels into the floor, twisting her neck to look back at the defense table. "Nia," she screamed, her voice tearing through the silent courtroom, raw and hysterical. "Nia, you have to stop this. I am your mother. You cannot let them take me." "Nia, look at me." I stood up slowly, brushing a piece of invisible lint from the lapel of my immaculate red blazer. I picked up my leather portfolio, closing it with a quiet, definitive snap. "Nia," Patricia wailed as the deputy pulled her through the doorway, the heavy steel door beginning to swing shut behind her. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I simply turned my back to the door and walked toward Evelyn Croft, leaving my mother's screams to echo uselessly against the cold mahogany walls. 2 months passed. The swift, brutal wheels of federal justice ground the Wilson family legacy into fine dust. DeAndre Hayes traded his custom-tailored Italian suits for a stiff, brightly colored federal-issue jumpsuit. He sat in a concrete holding cell at the Metropolitan Detention Center, awaiting a trial he had absolutely no hope of winning. The FBI had dismantled his shell companies within 48 hours of his arrest in Judge Vance's courtroom. His offshore accounts were seized, his luxury vehicles auctioned off, and his arrogant swagger completely erased by the terrifying reality of a 20-year minimum sentence for racketeering. There were no country club connections in federal lockup to save him. My parents faced an equally spectacular destruction. The perjury and conspiracy charges brought against Gerald and Patricia drained their retirement accounts faster than they could comprehend. They were forced to liquidate everything just to keep high-priced defense attorneys on retainer. Their sprawling suburban mansion was sold to satisfy mounting legal debts. The elite country club they had worshipped revoked their membership via a cold, sterile email. The church congregation they had ruled over for decades ousted them completely, unwilling to associate with accused felons who had tried to steal from their own daughter. They now lived in a cramped 2-bedroom rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. The stained beige carpets and peeling laminate countertops were a daily suffocating reminder of their spectacular fall from grace. They were completely isolated, trapped in a prison of their own making, left with nothing but their bitter regrets and the crushing weight of public humiliation. They ended up exactly where they had always believed I belonged. But the most poetic justice was reserved for Chloe. I stood on the glass-enclosed mezzanine of Vanguard Urban Holdings, looking down at the expansive Italian marble lobby. The morning sun streamed through the 3-story-high windows, illuminating the sleek, modern architecture of my empire. Down below, the security desk was handling a disturbance. A woman in a cheap, stiff polyester polo shirt bearing the logo of a discount retail chain was arguing frantically with my head of security. Her hair, previously maintained by weekly expensive salon blowouts, was pulled back in a messy, desperate knot. Her scuffed flat shoes squeaked against the pristine marble. It was Chloe. She slammed her hands against the polished granite of the reception desk, demanding access. I could hear the shrill, frantic pitch of her voice echoing through the cavernous lobby. "You do not understand," Chloe screamed at the impassive security guard. "I am her sister. We are blood. I need to see her right now. Tell her Chloe is down here. Tell her I need a job." I stepped onto the glass elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The descent was smooth and silent. I wore a tailored charcoal gray pantsuit with a crisp white silk blouse, my posture perfectly straight. I watched her through the glass as I descended, observing the frantic, desperate energy of a woman who had never worked a hard day in her life, suddenly forced to survive on minimum wage. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. I stepped out onto the marble floor. "Let her through, Marcus," I instructed my head of security. Marcus stepped back but kept his hand resting near his radio. Chloe spun around, her eyes widening as she took in my appearance. She looked at the expensive cut of my suit, the quiet authority I commanded, and the sheer scale of the Vanguard building. The reality of my $85 million corporate reality seemed to finally crush the last remaining fragments of her denial. Nia, Chloe gasped, rushing forward. She stopped a few feet away, intimidated by the cold, impassive look on my face. Nia, thank God. You have to help me. I crossed my arms, slowly evaluating the cheap retail name tag pinned haphazardly to her chest. State your business, Chloe. I have a board meeting in 10 minutes. Chloe's face crumpled and she burst into theatrical tears. It was the same manipulation tactic she had used since childhood, but stripped of her designer armor, it just looked pathetic. They took everything, Nia, she sobbed, gesturing wildly with her hands. The feds took the house. They took the cars. My accounts are frozen. I had to move into a terrible little apartment. I am working retail, Nia. Retail. I am on my feet for 9 hours a day, folding cheap sweaters for minimum wage. Customers yell at me. My manager is a teenager. It is a nightmare. You have to help me. We are family. You are mistaken, I replied, my voice echoing coldly in the vast lobby. We share genetic material. We are not family. Family does not stand in a federal courtroom and scream that their sister is insane to help a criminal steal her assets. I did not know, Chloe pleaded, tears streaming down her face, ruining her cheap mascara. I swear to you, Nia, I had no idea what DeAndre was doing. He lied to me too. He told me it was just a simple trust transfer. I was a victim. You cannot leave me like this. You have so much money. This building is huge. You could give me a job. Make me a vice president or a consultant, or just give me a loan. Just a couple of million to get me back on my feet. It is nothing to you. The sheer blinding entitlement of her demand was astonishing. Even standing in a cheap uniform begging for a lifeline, she still expected to be handed an executive position she had entirely zero qualifications for. She still viewed my hard-earned empire as a convenient piggy bank for her lifestyle. A vice president, I repeated softly, letting the absurdity of the words hang in the air. You want me to hand an executive position at a federally backed real estate holding company to a woman who cannot even manage to pin her retail name tag on straight? Chloe flushed, looking down at her crooked plastic badge. Nia, please do not do this. Do not punish me because DeAndre is a criminal. I am your little sister. We grew up together. We are blood. Blood does not excuse betrayal. Chloe, I said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. My voice was dangerously quiet, forcing her to stop crying and listen. Where was this loyalty to our blood when you sat in my parents' living room and laughed while they threatened to institutionalize me? Where was your sisterly love when you drove up to my apartment in your Mercedes and mocked my life? You called me a dropout. You called me a failure. You stood in a court of law and demanded the judge lock me away so you could keep funding your shopping sprees with stolen money. I was scared, Chloe stammered, taking a step backward. I did not know what to do. You were greedy, I corrected her sharply. You were greedy and lazy, and you thought I was an easy target. You thought because I did not wear designer clothes or brag about my bank accounts that I was weak. You built your entire life on the illusion of wealth funded by a fraud. Now the illusion is gone, and you are finally experiencing the real world. I cannot survive on minimum wage, Chloe wailed, covering her face with her hands. I do not know how to pay bills. I do not know how to budget. I am drowning, Nia. You have to save me. I will do anything. I will clean the floors here if I have to. Just please give me some money. I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no vindication, just a cold, clinical detachment. The emotional abuse that had kept me tethered to this toxic dynamic for 3 decades was completely severed. I looked at her and saw exactly what she was, a parasite searching for a new host. You are going to learn how to budget, Chloe, I said, my tone completely flat. You are going to learn how to pay rent on time. You are going to learn what it feels like to work a 9-hour shift and have your feet ache. You are going to experience exactly what you mocked me for doing all those years ago. You are going to learn how to survive. She dropped her hands, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. You cannot mean this. You cannot just turn your back on me. I did not flinch. I held her panicked gaze with absolute unyielding indifference. I remembered the sneer on her face in the courtroom. I remembered the arrogance in her voice when she told me I was a pathetic artist painting in alleys. I remembered every single insult she had ever hurled at me, believing she was completely untouchable. You told me once to stay in my lane, Chloe, I said, ensuring every single word struck like a physical blow. This is my lane, and you are trespassing. I raised my right hand and snapped my fingers once, a sharp, loud crack that echoed perfectly through the marble lobby. Marcus stepped forward instantly, flanked by two other large security guards in dark suits. They moved with coordinated professional efficiency, cutting off Chloe's path to me. Ma'am, it is time for you to leave, Marcus said, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. Nia, no, Chloe screamed as the guards took her by the arms. You cannot do this. I am your sister. Nia, please, I have nothing. I turned my back on her, returning to the glass elevator. I pressed the button for the executive floor. The doors began to slide shut as the guards physically marched a thrashing, sobbing Chloe toward the revolving front doors of the Vanguard building. Her desperate cries bounced off the expensive Italian marble, growing fainter as they pushed her out onto the crowded city street. The thick glass doors of the elevator sealed shut completely, cutting off the sound of her frantic begging. I stood alone in the quiet ascending car, watching the city skyline rise before me. The toxic anchors that had dragged me down for 32 years were finally gone. My empire awaited. 2 years passed. The swift, brutal wheels of federal justice had completely ground the Wilson family legacy into fine dust. And from that dust, I had built a monument. The bright morning sun beat down on the vibrant, bustling corner of 4th Street. The empty dirt lot that had once been the battleground for my freedom was completely unrecognizable. In its place stood the Martha Wilson Innovation Center. It was a towering 3-story structure of gleaming reinforced glass, polished steel, and warm cedar accents. It was not just a building. It was the physical manifestation of my $85 million vision. Inside those glass walls were state-of-the-art technology labs, fully funded business incubators, and grant offices specifically designed to uplift Black youth in our community. I had taken the very land my family tried to steal from me and turned it into an engine of generational wealth for people who actually deserved it. A massive crowd had gathered, blocking the entire street. News vans with satellite dishes hummed loudly along the perimeter, their cameras focused entirely on the grand entrance. The mayor of the city stood to my right, adjusting his expensive tie, while the local press corps jostled for the best angle. City council members, wealthy investors, and community leaders all mingled excitedly, waiting for my signal. I stood at the center of it all, radiating absolute power. I wore a stunning, flawlessly tailored ivory suit that contrasted beautifully against the warm summer morning. I felt completely untouchable. Directly across the street, pushed hard against the heavy steel police barricades, stood the pathetic remnants of the Wilson family. They looked entirely foreign. Gerald looked incredibly frail. His broad, intimidating shoulders were permanently slumped under the crushing weight of his federal probation and massive financial ruin. His expensive tailored suits had been auctioned off long ago, replaced by a faded, ill-fitting jacket that hung off his shrinking frame. Patricia stood beside him, her face deeply lined and hollow. Her hair, once maintained by weekly expensive salon treatments, was thinning and brittle. She clutched a cheap vinyl purse, her knuckles white. Chloe stood next to them, wearing the exact same stiff polyester retail uniform she had worn when she begged for a job in my lobby. Her expression was a mask of permanent, bitter exhaustion. The luxury vehicles, the country club memberships, the designer wardrobes, they were all gone. They had drained their entire retirement savings just to keep Gerald and Patricia out of a federal penitentiary. They now lived in a cramped, noisy rental apartment on the outskirts of the city. They were completely stripped of their power, their wealth, and their suffocating arrogance. They were just anonymous faces trapped in a sea of cheering spectators. I stepped up to the clear acrylic podium, tapping the microphone once. A sudden respectful hush fell over the massive crowd of 500 people. Today we are not just opening a building. I projected my voice clear and resonant, ensuring it carried all the way across the street to the barricades. We are opening doors that have been deliberately closed to this community for decades. We are providing the capital, the technology, and the unwavering support that every brilliant mind deserves but so rarely receives. I looked up at the massive silver lettering mounted above the main entrance. The letters gleamed in the sunlight. This center is named after my grandmother, Martha Wilson. I continued, my voice softening with genuine affection. She was the only person who truly believed in my potential when I was told to shrink myself. She did not just leave me a piece of commercial real estate, she left me a profound legacy of resilience. She taught me that true wealth is never measured by the zip code you live in, the cars you drive, or the superficial image you project to the world. True wealth is having the power to uplift others. True success is building a foundation so strong that no one can ever tear it down or take it away from you. I did not mention my parents. I did not mention my sister or my former brother-in-law currently serving time in federal prison. I did not cast a single glance across the street. As far as my narrative and my reality were concerned, they simply did not exist. They were ghosts, haunting the outer perimeter of a world they could no longer touch. They had been entirely erased from my story. Across the street, Patricia gripped the cold metal of the police barricade, her hands shaking violently. The crowd around her was clapping loudly, moved by the speech. Patricia turned to a woman standing next to her, a total stranger holding a celebratory balloon for her child. "That is my daughter up there," Patricia whispered frantically, pointing a trembling finger at the podium, her eyes wild and desperate for any shred of recognition. "I raised her. I made her who she is. She is my blood." The stranger looked Patricia up and down, taking in her worn clothes, her erratic behavior, and her desperate, clinging energy. The woman simply rolled her eyes, let out a loud scoff of disgust, and took 2 deliberate steps away, leaving my mother standing entirely alone in the crowd. No one cared who she was. No one believed her. She was utterly irrelevant. Back on the pristine steps of the center, the mayor handed me a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors. The heavy metal handles gleamed brightly. I smiled warmly at the flashing cameras and grabbed the thick red ribbon stretching across the glass double doors. I squeezed the handles together, slicing cleanly through the fabric with a sharp, satisfying sound. The crowd erupted into deafening cheers. Confetti cannons fired, raining shimmering silver and gold paper down from the roof, catching the bright morning light. The applause echoed down the city block, a roaring validation of everything I had fought to build. I handed the scissors back to the mayor and shook his hand, flashing a brilliant, genuine smile. I turned my back on the street, on the metal barricades, and on the 3 broken people watching helplessly from the gutter. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and walked into the cool, expansive lobby of my own empire, leaving my toxic family behind in the dust, permanently erased from my glorious new life.